Welcome back to the Hardware Unbox podcast for episode 51. This is our Ryzen 7 9800X3D review recap / discussion. Lots of things to go through in this one. We'll be chatting more about the performance, the implications for Intel in particular with their CPU lineup, some of the reasons behind the performance that we're seeing, I/O bottleneck potentially, and then there is as well in this episode an extensive talk about CPU benchmarking and why we do CPU benchmarking the way that we do it, because once again, people have criticized us or at least made some comments on other videos that we've seen about not testing at 1440p and 4K and sort of our struggles through that discussion again, because we kind of thought that we'd solved that, but potentially not because it keeps coming up. So anyway, there's a lengthy discussion about that in this episode as well. So let's get into it. Steve, exciting CPUs to talk about. Finally, something has happened in the market that we can get excited about. How you doing?
Good. Excited, reinvigorated. I've been benchmarking non-stop since I got the CPU. So I've already done a 45 game head-to-head with the 7800X3D, which will be on the channel tomorrow night. So 24 hours after the podcast goes live or thereabouts. So already done that. Testing the 14900K now. Some really interesting results in that particular matchup across the 45 games. It looks like I've found a couple of games, I guess spoiler alert, where the Core i9 does win. So that's interesting, but I've got to verify those results still to make sure that, everything was above board. There wasn't any funny business with upscaling or whatever happening, because sometimes those features like to turn themselves on. But I think the results are looking pretty accurate. But yeah, like I said, I'll verify them and then you'll see that video. We've got a pretty stacked schedule next week, don't we? You've got quite a bit of content coming out, but I think probably midweek I'll hope to try and get it out by. But it'll be sometime next week, so that's good. And then I've obviously got the 285K. I want to do a motherboard buying guide for that CPU because our channel's been littered with requests for that in the comments section, so I might as well make that happen.
A motherboard buying guide for the 285K?
No, for the 7800X. I'm talking about this is 7800X3D related stuff.
Right. I was like,
yeah, the 280.
Are there comments that are requesting motherboard content for the 285K?
There actually is a bit. Not a lot. Well, there's more than I was expecting. Let's just say that.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess probably the motherboard side of things is more interesting, but. Anyway, so the 285K comparison with the 9800X3D will be coming either later next week or the week after. But moving on from that, motherboard testing. A lot of people have been asking for motherboard buying guides, in particular for the 9800X3D. So I'll put something together. I'll probably do like a final X870 motherboard buying guide, and then I'll do just a general one, because obviously there's a lot of great value B650 boards that you'd probably want to pair instead for like a gaming build. So I've got that coming up. And of course, I am also testing Z890 motherboards. That's an ongoing endeavor, that one. I'm just going to be dedicating one content piece to that because you and I are quite confident that video is going to bomb, which sucks because I actually want to do it. We're going to have about 50 motherboards, which is a spectacular number of motherboards. And it's very cool. And we're sort of in a unique position where the motherboard manufacturers do throw the boards at us. Like historically, back in the day, it was very hard to get your hands on boards. But, ASRock just delivered their entire lineup in 2 gigantic boxes. So that was easy. And Asus had most of theirs in already. So it's cool that we get all the boards. Like, it's rare that you can just get your hands on all of them and compare them all under the same conditions and give your sort of opinions on all of them. So, yeah, we'll do that in the one video, but you weren't keen on multiple videos for that one, which understandable.
I think the motherboard videos, the interest in them is very heavily related to the quality of the CPU. So, I'm just astonished personally that there are more Z890 motherboards than X870 motherboards, because even in the lead up to this CPU generation, all things were pointed to, like if you're a motherboard manufacturer, this is what I'm thinking about. Months ahead of time, you're sort of thinking, we've got to prioritize making things. I would have thought that even before we saw Zen 5 sort of underwhelm quite significantly, that you'd be like, well, AM4 has been selling super well. AMD CPUs are very popular. Let's have this incredible X870 lineup. Let's just go all out. I know it's a refresh, so it's not essential to have these new boards.
Mhm.
But I mean, the amount of boards that they're making for Z890 relative to the interest that we're seeing from people buying them. Like, I know the 285K has sold out. Not sure if that's a supply issue. Doesn't seem like they made too many of them. But the interest from the 9800 XUD has just blown that part completely out of the water. Yet it seems like all these motherboard vendors have just been going crazy on the Z890 stuff. So,
Yeah,
strange one.
like you said, you could attribute that to the fact that it's a straight refresh and they technically already offer those products. So why, offer them all again? And motherboard manufacturers were well aware that the initial Zen 5 parts were extremely underwhelming and just weren't going to sell well. But they were also, I don't know how far ahead of time, but I know before we were made aware, they knew the 9800X3D was something special. Like it was going to take the best of the best to the next level. And there was obviously going to be a lot of interest in that. So, yeah, I think what it boils down to is what we've talked about in the past. We know for a fact that Intel subsidizes motherboard manufacturers, and they have various reasons for why they do that. I think the strategy historically has been just flood the shelves with Intel branded products and basically make the Intel brand overwhelming. So there's far fewer Intel options. They also, like, Intel's been very, very aggressive in the past. So I don't know for sure because I've heard various different things from people within the industry that deal with this, but let's just say subsidize them in one way or another to make it more financially viable to produce Intel motherboards. Let's go with that. But then they also do the same thing at the distribution and retail level. So they're really hands-on the whole way to basically to the shelf to ensure that Intel essentially bullies out the competition. That's what they've done historically. And it was very easy to do when AMD was barely competitive or not really competitive at all. But now that AMD is very competitive, people tend to do a lot more research these days and information's much more easily accessible with stuff like YouTube. Those strategies don't work as well, but they're still being employed, obviously, because there's really, outside of the kind of explanations we gave at the start of this, there's no real reason for why you should see twice as many Intel motherboards.
I think one potential reason that we have heard from board makers in the past is relating to not every motherboard that's made is designed specifically for DIY customers. So while there are a lot of boards that are still produced for like you can go and buy one. There's no problems buying these boards, but there might be a particular large OEM or system integrated customer that goes, I want this exact spec lineup on my board. So I want this amount of PCI slots, this amount of USB, and they essentially custom order a board. And then the motherboard manufacturer then goes and sells that to consumers as sort of like an extra thing, but they may not necessarily be guaranteeing like, there's no point, for example, like you see ASRock's lineup. The differences in some of those boards are very small. And so you're thinking as a consumer, like, why is there two boards that look effectively identical? Or occasionally you see people being like, why is there a motherboard that's still got like a VGA port on it? Like, surely they're not making boards with VGA or PS2 ports on them anymore. And that's usually because some OEM customer has gone, well, we're going to buy 20,000 of those boards, so please make it with that spec. And then they try and sell an extra couple of hundred or couple of thousand to consumers. So I think that plays into it a little bit with the Intel boards, because Intel still has some sort of presence in those pre-built systems, OEM systems. And as you say, that could be related to the whole, trying to get into the distribution systems and offering incentives and those sort of things to build Intel pre-builts, or just offering really good deals to those customers. So I think that all plays into it as to why there's, so many boards, because we get questions all the time about like, how do I choose between these two boards that look identical, or why is there this port on, or why is there this configuration that's a really weird configuration? And yeah, usually it's because of OEM customers. And at Computex, we heard from board makers about how popular Intel still is in some regions, especially for those pre-builts, and
Mhm.
how for the DIY market, even though it may look like AMD is significantly outselling Intel, as far as their actual motherboard sales internally, it's a lot more even than you would think between the two brands, which I thought was quite interesting. So that may explain it a little bit, but at least for the DIY market, it does look a little unusual how many Z series boards there are.
Yeah, it's a contributing factor for sure. It's not a significant contributing factor, but there'll be a multitude of contributing factors. So that's certainly one of them. I think if you really look at the lineups, you can probably pick maybe one. Like from B650, there was 1 GB board that was custom made, let's say, and then just sold at retail. So there are some examples, but you look at like ASRock's lineup, and it's pretty stock standard. Like you've got your A, I think it's the A series board, then you got your Pro RS, your Lightnings, all the Riptides, and basically every kind of model they've come up with is there, and then some. Like I think it's 3 different versions of the Tai Chi, so there's plenty of boards there. I don't think any of them seem to be that custom made. There's just, at least for a specific client, it's just it almost seems like someone has said, we need 15 Z890 motherboards, come up with 15 different boards, which is why you see, I think that explains more why you see there's the Pro RS that's white, and then there's the one that's black, and then there's the one that has Wi-Fi, and there's like 4 different
Yeah,
versions of essentially the same board. And
I
it
think
seems like there's a quota there that needs to be met on how many different models they have.
I think the quota is because of just price points. They want to hit a whole bunch of different price points. Like removing Wi-Fi tends to only affect the price by a
$10,
couple of
yeah.
dollars, maybe $10. But that just allows them so many more different options for consumers and OEM customers as well. Because if an OEM customer wants to, they're choosing between the lineup and they want to save $10 on the motherboard across however many units of system they're making, then if ASRock's produced 15 models, they can just go in and choose the exact price that suits the target that they're looking for. Or if they want to spend $10 more, then there's another board ready for them right there to spend money on. So I
Well,
think, yeah, that's all plays into it.
to potentially poke holes in this theory of yours, so there's a Z890 Tai Chi Aqua, right? Which
Yep.
is, the VRM heat sinks support liquid cooling, for example. And then there's a Z890 Tai Chi overclocking edition, dual dim board. Then there's the Z890 Tai Chi, which is the
Yep.
standard 4 dim fully fledged Tai Chi. Then there's the Tai Chi Lite, which is that board, but with all the RGB and fancy heatsink stripped off it. So you've got 4 Tai Chi motherboards on what is an extremely underwhelming platform. So for X870, there's 2 Tai Chi boards. That's it. There's no overclocking edition board. There's no liquid cooled board. So there's nothing fancy like that. And if you go to their AMD 600 series boards, it's the same story. So that was a hugely popular platform. Like Zen 4 was exciting and new. And there's no liquid cooled Tai Chi or anything like that. So in fact, you only got one Tai Chi and then sort of the white black version. But there's just so many boards, and these are high end boards, so they're not like someone's ordering a special weird board with like 8 PCIe times 1 slots or something. These are their flagship premium enthusiast based boards that sell for really high price tags and probably low volume as well, so it's a bit of a risk making them. And it just seems unusual that straight out of the gate you would see, a Tai Chi Aqua and a Tai Chi OC and all that sort of stuff. To me, it seems like there's strong financial incentives there for a smaller company like ASRock to take what would otherwise be large risks on these low volume, expensive boards.
Possibly. I mean, I guess with like overclocking boards, they probably No, like if I was making an overclocking board, I think Intel's generally been the more popular platform for overclocking.
Mhm.
So, that might play into like those sort of super high end boards. But yeah, like it doesn't really make sense to have four of those super high end platforms. Maybe they thought the CPUs would be better and more exciting, which would drum up again those sort of sales for high end parts. And, with Intel, I guess like generally the higher end CPUs have been the more popular products. Like if you were going to buy like a 13th or 14th gen CPU, a lot of people were buying 13900Ks, 14900Ks to get that sort of ultimate performance. I guess if they guessed that a 285K was going to offer similar performance to a 14900K, which is certainly what Intel was suggesting, then maybe they were thinking let's stack the high end a bit more. But I think it's, as we've said, sort of a combination of all the different factors that we've been talking about to make those sort of lineups so big. But anyway, let's talk about the 9800 XGD, not motherboard lineups, because the 9800
Well,
XGD.
I got a lot of motherboards to test though, Tim. So no, go on.
Well, enjoy that. Enjoy that.
Yeah.
I would not want to be doing that testing. Anyway,
Yeah.
so the 9800 XGD is actually good. It's not, the performance gains over the 7800 XGD aren't mind blowing, but compared to the parts we've seen over the last couple of months, it's certainly the best processor
Mhm.
that's been released this year. So, yeah, relative to the 7800 XGD, I think you saw for gaming performance about an 11% uplift on average.
Mhm.
AMD were claiming an 8% uplift on average. So, you actually found it performed better than what AMD was saying, which was
Mhm.
a good change from what we saw with Zen 5, where it underperformed what they were saying. And obviously, those margins that you saw in the review compared to Intel parts like the 14900K and the 285K are substantial,
Mm.
leading you to conclude that this is really the first time that we've seen AMD having a decisive lead in the gaming CPU market. It really hasn't happened before. At least, like I said, I remember when we were chatting earlier, I said, "Oh, this must be the first time they've had a lead of that magnitude for decades, at least as long as I can remember being part of the sort of PC enthusiast platform." And you've been doing it for longer, and you basically just said ever. So
I think
that's the
ever.
position that we're in.
Yeah, I haven't gone and confirmed whether that's technically true or true at all, but
Mm,
I think we saw on average nearly a 30% uplift over the 1400K. It was at least
yeah,
27%, which is wild. And it was about 33% over the 285K, but let's go with the 14900K is still their flagship gaming CPU. I mean, the power usage there is just astronomical. I saw some people complaining rather about the power draw of the 9800X3D relative to the 7800X3D because the 7800X3D sips power, but the 9800X3D doesn't use that much power. The 1400K uses a lot of
mm,
power, and the 285K reduced that enough to the point where I was comfortable saying in my 285K review that power consumption there is it's no longer an issue. It's not a concern. Like when you're talking about high-end gaming rigs, like we're talking about CPUs that are paired with high-end gaming GPUs, 50 watts
yeah,
is nothing. Like when you're under full load, a 50 watt difference is really, you don't want to go too much more than that because then heat and stuff starts to become a problem. But as long as the CPUs, and I think that was the big thing with the 1400K, as long as it's relatively easy to keep cool away from the 100 degree TJ max or 105 TJ max, but if as long as you keep it away from that 100 degree sort of point, you're down in the below 90, I think somewhere in the 80s for those newer parts, then that's perfectly fine. That's reasonable.
yeah.
And we're talking with like a 360 millimeter AIO. So when you pinging it at 100 degrees on a 1400K with a big old AIO strapped on, that's less than ideal. But yeah, that power consumption, I don't think is something to criticize the 9800X3D for.
Well, it's middle of the pack, isn't it? Like it
Mm-hmm.
was very comparable to a lot of the other Zen 5 CPUs,
Mm-hmm.
and Zen 4 CPUs, the non-X3D parts, of course, while delivering substantially more performance. So from that standpoint, sort of middle of the pack, it's much more, it's more efficient than those other Zen 4, Zen 5 processors because, again, same power consumption, but more
Yeah,
performance.
it's less efficient than the 7800X3D, which is the
Yeah,
criticism.
that's
But
true, but it's like that was an outlier almost. It's like that part was so efficient that
yeah,
it's not the benchmark for the whole CPU market being like, well,
sure.
the 7800 XGD is what every CPU should have. It's like, well, Ideally, yes, but if it was a little more power consumption, middle of the pack, similar to other CPUs, I don't think it's a big issue. And that
Mhm.
certainly is what you'd said in your review too.
Yeah, the big surprise with the 9800X3D really came before we even got to the gaming benchmarks, which obviously I was very exciting to get to, but
Mm,
I usually start with, well, Cinebench is a good place to start with just to verify that you're seeing the overall CPU performance that you should be seeing. And then you look at stuff like memory performance and all that just to dial it in. But yeah, Cinebench had some surprises for us because with the 7800X3D, and this was true for the 5800X3D before it, it was 5% slower than the non 3D model. So the 7700X
mm,
in that particular matchup. So a 5% reduction in multi core workloads, not significant. It's not a productivity CPU, but you know, that was the situation there.
yep.
And then to find a 15% improvement for the 9800X 3D over the 9700X while they were both running at the same clock speeds was a little bit confusing initially, but then it quickly explained why the 9700X kind of sucks, why it was so underwhelming.
Mm,
And it has to be that IO die that's creating the bottleneck that's really limiting the Zen 5 architecture from delivering the gains, the IPC gains that you expect. And it's the whole thing's odd, really odd. The Zen 5 launch from the start because we got those, what was it, 16% IPC claims
yeah.
from AMD. And if it wasn't for the IO die bottlenecking the Zen 5 architecture, those claims would have been accurate. It may have even been underselling it slightly, but they would have been accurate. Because as I said, we saw a 15% uplift over the 9700X, which is more than a 15% increase over the 7700X, but only by a few more percentage points. So that gets you to that IPC claim, right? It's just, yeah, it's more Zen 5 weirdness. So I don't know how they came up with a lot of the numbers they came up with, but it almost, to me, seemed like they were, I don't want to say like almost estimates based on what the architecture was capable of, but didn't end up
Mm,
ringing true for the actual package that they put together. I don't know.
yeah.
It's a weird one.
It's possible that they were looking more at. I think they tested those IPC claims on desktop processors. So to be
Mhm,
clear, I believe their claims were based on actual desktop CPUs. But I think if they were talking about, what gain should we be showing, like, there can be a bias when benchmarking of trying to get results that you think the part should be capable of. But obviously, Zen 5 for the server is packed with a much more substantial memory subsystem. So they're using like quad or 8 channel memory with DDR5 at decent speeds as well. And so, yes, those CPUs also have significantly more cores for the server, platforms. It's possible that, with so much more memory bandwidth, that they're not going to be as limited by the dual channel DDR5 setup that they're going with the IO die that they're using for the desktop part. So if they've gone with the server parts and gone, well, in this sort of memory unlimited or less limited scenario, generally we see IPC of 16%. Let's try and make the desktop workloads, let's try get to that number that we've seen for the server parts as well. And again, like those IPC claims will also a little bit exaggerated due to the inclusion of like the AVX 512 stuff, which
mhm,
again for desktop workloads at the moment isn't that useful outside of edge case sort of stuff. So
mhm,
that played into it a little bit as well. But yeah, like I think the interesting decision there was if they knew that this core that they'd designed was going to be so limited by memory early on in the design phase, like they designed the core and then it was a huge overhaul compared to Zen 4. Like throughout all the meetings that we'd heard, this part was overhauled, that part was overhauled, redesigned this. The biggest change to the Zen architecture since Zen 1.
mhm,
You know, it's odd that they would pair that with the exact same IO die that they used previously. Like it's just a very interesting choice. I'm sure there's some sort of reason for it, whether
mm,
that was they've already produced a ton of them, they had to use them, or the next generation IO die wasn't ready, or some reason along those lines. But to completely overhaul the core, not change the IO die, and then it now playing out with 9800X3D reviews as some people had correctly theorized, so good job to those people that had theorized it, it sort of has played out, hasn't it? That there's some limitation there that the extra cache and things is helping with.
Yeah, well, initially we were claiming, which is still true to a degree. I mean, it's still true. Is that the Zen 5 architecture was optimized for development work, server workloads, AI, all that sort of stuff, which is definitely where it shines. But it's still, the Zen 5 architecture was better than what the 9700X represented it to us. So that was interesting to see straight away. Very confusing stuff to find a 15% performance increase over the 9700X at the same clock speeds. That was a bit of a... I remember sending you the data and you're like, well, what? That doesn't really make sense. And then we both concluded that, the IO die has to be the problem there. And then I did more benchmarking, confirmed the data with AMD, and it was accurate. So yeah, that was really interesting. And then we jumped into the gaming benchmarks and saw some really substantial gains, like Hogwarts Legacy, 21%, and a few other games where the gains were just massive. Starfield was another shocker, because that's where Zen 5 previously, with the non-3D Vcache models, really they sucked in that example. They were quite a bit slower than Zen 4. But then this Zen 5 3D Vcache enabled part just blows the 7800X 3D and everything out of the water. So complete turnaround there. Exciting stuff. It was really good to see. Again, it makes you keep questioning like why the non-3D Vcache parts are the way they are and why they even bothered releasing them and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, if your theory of IO dies clearing them out, then I guess that would make sense. Like, they're like, well, we can't, I mean, they're selling them on the 9800X 3D anyway, but yeah, that allows them to sell many more of them. Well,
I mean,
if they were to sell.
I think it's possible that strategy was decided quite a while ago, so it may not be related to supply at all. It could just be, well, they were hoping that the IO die would hold up for that design, and Zen 5 came in better than they thought, so they got more gains out of it. It was just too memory limited or something along those lines. There's all those sorts of possibilities, but yeah, the CPU turning out to be good is a really good thing, I think, because a lot of people have been desperate, I think, for a product to get excited about, to talk about in a way that's positive. And you've been talking a bit on Twitter/X about, the whole reviews, positive reviews are good for the industry. Negative reviews are not necessarily good for views. I think we talked about in the last podcast. We won't get into that again, but this has definitely been true throughout the 9800X 3D. And at least in my opinion, I think if AMD had their time again, they should have released the 9800X 3D first, so before the other Zen 5 models. I think in the past, they've launched the non-X3D first to try and get people, maybe you consider an upgrade to the non-X3D parts with the performance upgrades that they were providing. But I think for this generation, if they'd launched with this part and people could see the 11% gain over the previous model, it beating Intel's parts significantly, and then later coming out with the more productivity-focused chips, even if those were not that impressive, I think the framing of the whole generation would have been better. You'd have been like, well,
they're not as good for productivity though, so it's a tough one. I hear what you're saying. But I don't know if it's right or wrong, because say they did lead with it like you're suggesting and everyone was super excited and Zen 5 was amazing and we got this really expensive $480 US CPU that's the best of the best and it's awesome, and then everyone who can't afford a $480 US CPU is like, I can't wait for the $300 US version, the ones that get down into the $200 US range, they're going to be amazing, and then they arrive and they're terrible. That would have been a huge letdown, and that's regardless of what AMD actually says. Because ultimately what killed Zen 5 was AMD's, them not setting expectations correctly, essentially, is what the problem was there. But
yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right.
I guess the point is with Zen 5, the non-3D Vcache parts being so underwhelming, they're underwhelming. Like, they were going to disappoint no matter what. You release them first and everyone's like, oh, Zen 5 is underwhelming. But then you sort of have this redemption tour where the 9800X 3D ends up being much better than expected and everyone gets excited again, and that becomes the focus. Whereas if you lead with that first and everyone gets excited about that, that's the focus, I think it almost would kill the Zen 5 hype and excitement when you release those parts. So it's kind
Depends
of
if
like,
you try and hide them or not.
well, okay, Tim, I've got some bad news and some good news. Which would you like first? Most people are like, hit me with the bad news so I can get that crap out of the way. And then I want some uplifting good news it's like the aftertaste. I want a good aftertaste on this launch. I don't know. I'm not sure which reality would have played out better. I'm certain the reality that would have played out the best is the one where they didn't make claims relative to Intel gaming CPUs, where they were like, we're going to smash these CPUs by 12%, and you're going to get a 16% IPC improvement, all that sort of stuff that didn't eventuate for those non-3D V-Cache Zen 5 parts.
Could have just left those sort of claims for the 9800 XD, couldn't they? Because those claims were not only would have been accurate for that part, but it would have been even better than those sort of claims for the 9800 XD. So they could have just left it for that. I mean, the other option is release all the parts at the same time, which is again sort of like a high. Like, I guess what I'm trying to think of is like, how could they have hid the Zen 5 other CPU launches?
Yeah, that's right.
So to minimize the damage, and I guess you could release it on, I don't know, like US election day or one of those days where you bury all your bad news. So you're like, I'm not saying this is for political reasons or anything, but like that's when when there's big major world events, that's when you bury stuff. So either release it at the same time, wait for one of those events, I don't know, something like that. But they had to bury it.
I think the best strategy is release them at the same time, but the non-3D V-Cache parts, they're coming in to replace. You're getting an incremental upgrade. If you were looking at buying Zen 4, you're now getting Zen 5 instead. It's got a few small improvements, some advantages that may be realized further down the track, and they're coming in at a small price premium, which is the current price. So don't do the BS overpriced price that results in negative feedback from consumers and reviewers. Just launch them at the current price they're at with the discounts pre-applied, and you sell it as the new what pushes the needle forward in terms of performance right now is the 3D V-Cache model, so you have them as an option. But if you're looking at buying a 7700X, well, now you've got the 9700X, we can deliver similar performance at a lower TDP target. I mean, however they want to sell that BS, and as long as the price is okay and it's not a huge premium, people will be like, okay, yep, no worries, whatever. It's a nothing burger, and they remain. The excitement remains for the X3D model. I know that's probably the best way they could have gone about it.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen some criticism of the 9800 XOD's price as being too high.
It's not
$1,080, but like
it's not an extreme edition $1,000 CPU. So
yeah, I think for the fastest gaming CPU on the market, it's actually quite a reasonable price compared to what we've gotten historically. Like if you look across all the Intel CPUs, which have historically been the fastest gaming CPU, they've been above $500 US, $600, which with inflation added on now is even more expensive. So to have this part come in below $500 and delivering the gains that it's getting, and especially relative to the Intel parts, I think is pretty reasonable. And yeah, like the 7800 XG, after launch, a couple of months, it was quite cheap. So relative to those prices, it's not great, but also the 7800 X3D at launch wasn't clearly the fastest gaming CPU by a significant margin. It was kind of a toss-up between...
It was still the best.
That part. It was still the best, and most people bought it. The 14900K didn't see the sales I think Intel was hoping for. But this part, I think, is clear. Like, it'd be a silly decision, in my opinion, to buy an Intel CPU this generation.
You can't.
Previously, it's like, yeah, maybe. Now it's like, no. In which case, the price, as we've talked about with like flagship GPUs and those sorts of things, when you've got the best of the best part that's clearly superior to everything else, and you're still offering other options for value, people that are more concerned with value, the pricing discussion does change a little bit, at least in my opinion. So I think it's a good price, but obviously other people disagree.
Yeah, people obviously don't love a bit of a price premium, but I think if you're after the best of the best flagship type performance and you're pairing it with, like, realistically, you're going to be pairing this with what, an RTX 4080 minimum, like 7900 XTX, 4090 class GPU. So you're talking about near enough to $1,000 plus, closer to $2,000 at the high end for your GPU. So really, the CPU's a bargain. And you also don't need ultra expensive DDR5 memory to get the most out of it. Low latency
Yep.
DDR5 6000, so the memory is relatively affordable. You can chuck it on a entry level-ish B650 motherboard and get maximum performance and maximum memory performance. You're talking $120 to $140 US for the motherboard. So it's not like you have to spend $480 US on the CPU and then $300 US on the motherboard and $200 to $300 US on your memory. And before you know it, the platform's like $1,000. It's, not that bad. But yeah, I'm not justifying it either. It's just what it is, guys. Like, they've made the best gaming CPU, and there is, if you're honest about it, there is no competition for this part. There's no competition at all. The competition's the 7800X3D, and AMD saw to that prior to launch.
Yeah, they effectively discontinued it.
They knew the only competition was that. Like, if you're aware of what the 1400K is and what it offers, and you're aware of the 9800X3D, and you buy the 1400K, you probably need to get yourself checked. Like, you're probably certifiable at that point. Like, it's just, you're crazy for getting the.
It's like a cultist sort of move in it, isn't it? Like, it's sort of like, if you still at this point think that Intel has the fastest gaming CPU in general, like, sure, you might find some applications or some games.
They're outliers at this point. They're outliers.
Yeah,
it's the fastest in outliers. You really have to go, based on the 45 game test that I'm well and truly into at this point in time, you really have to go looking to make the Core i9 competitive, and then certainly really have to go looking to make it faster. And then there's the whole power consumption thing and all the other stability and degradation issues that have plagued that part, which may or may not be fixed at this point in time. We don't really know. No competition. So that's that. Anyway, I'll let you move on, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I think the price at launch is usually for people who do want to do that sort of early adopting and generally have higher end systems, which I think plays into your, talking about people with $1,000 GPUs, because I'm sure people complain and say like, oh, I buy a 7800 XUD when I only have a 4070 or 4060 or whatever. I'm sure there's people that do that, but I think people that do that sort of buying with more mid-range and entry, or not that a 4060 is necessarily entry level, but you know what I mean, mainstream systems, tend to buy that sort of CPU later in its life cycle where it's a bit cheaper, a bit more affordable. You're not going straight out on day one to purchase even a $450 CPU if your GPU is $500. Most people don't do that. So, I think that because this part has no competition, it's going to be probably a longer wait before it becomes cheaper and better priced. But at least it gives people a genuine upgrade on the AM5 platform, which I think is really good for people that have gone in with products like 7600. Like, this 9800 XUD is a substantial upgrade over a 7600 in terms of gaming performance. And so if you're one of those people that is, you've got your 4060 and maybe a 7600 or that sort of system, then in a couple of years, maybe next year at some point, and you're thinking of that GPU and CPU upgrade, the 9800 XUD will hopefully be a little less than $480, and it will be presenting you with a good upgrade. So
there's every likelihood it'll be in the $300 range, probably the high $300 range. But based on people have said, because it is the fastest gaming CPU now and it is unchallenged, that there won't be any price cuts. But I don't think that'll be the case at all. That's generally,
I mean, the 7800 XUD was generally called the best gaming CPU, and that received price cuts. So it was a more competitive market. But
people who want them and they're willing to pay $480 do that relatively quickly. And then there's the other people, like, I really like the performance, but don't want to pay $480 US. If it gets down to $400 US or dips in the $300 US range, that's where I'll pull the trigger. And AMD knows that those people are waiting there, or they're people who are on the fence. They just incentivize them, like they just they can't pass up the deal. And just quickly to circle back to what you were saying about 4070 owners and stuff like that, there is obviously the esports scene, games like Counter-Strike, where a 4070 is almost always going to be CPU limited. Same applies to games like Fortnite, using the DirectX 11 performance mode. It's basically CPU limited mode. So if you want to drive high frame rates, which I certainly do when I play, 300 is my minimum. Your CPU limited there. So That's where I will for that reason be upgrading my system. I'm using a 4090 anyway, so I'm not using a 4070, but the 4090 is essentially sleeping in Fortnite in the performance mode. It's waiting for the CPU all the time. So
yeah. I mean, it's one of those it depends situations, isn't it? Lots of people have different configurations. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's always the case. The other thing I want to talk about is Intel at the moment, because I think this CPU launch has put Intel into a precarious position is probably the best way of putting it. I think they're a little bit in trouble because, again, we talked about in the previous podcast, at least in my opinion, the desktop DIY market is for people buying gaming CPUs. I think that makes up the majority of people buying these parts. And right now, I think Intel has effectively zero, I don't know if you would agree, but effectively zero viable gaming options. The Arrow Lake just wasn't positioned for gamers at all. Like the pricing and the performance of those parts make no sense for gaming.
Mhm.
And older generation models are still available, but the majority of them are, I wouldn't say they're like amazing must buys. There's nothing that's, would you buy like a older Core i5 relative to a Ryzen 5 7600, especially now that we've got this clear upgrade path?
Like, yeah,
It's,
I
yeah.
haven't looked at it closely. I know the 12th gen parts in a lot of regions are dirt cheap now, but
Hmm.
yeah, are you gonna buy a 12 600K on what we know is a dead platform
Hmm.
over a 7600X? And presumably you're tossing up between those two because you're doing a full platform upgrade. I don't know what the motherboard pricing, how much that differs, but yeah, like, and again, if you're using the more affordable DDR5 6000 memory, that favors AMD more because you really need to get the higher frequency memory on the 12600K to really take advantage
Yeah.
of it, or at least for it to be competitive, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I've just looked at pricing. So a Ryzen 5 7600 that we've been talking about, you can get that for a little under $200, so
Mhm,
$190 to $195.
mhm,
The 12600K, at least on Newegg at the moment, is $170, and you can
okay.
get the 12400. I was just looking for $130. So, for the 12600K to get sort of similar performance to the 7600, in fact, I think the 7600 is actually faster.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yep.
You're sacrificing, for $30, you're sacrificing platform upgradability and that sort of thing, and you're not getting as fast of a processor. And for the 12400, like, yeah, it's $130. Like, it's a pretty low price. It's lower than you'd find from an AM5 model. But again, like it's a slower part. It's comparable to like an AM4 CPU, like Ryzen 5000. So
Yeah, and if you do consider the upgrade angle, like you've said,
you would
you
just,
have the possibility of getting a 9800X 3D quite cheap, or potentially Zen 6
mhm.
in the future. Whereas, what are you going to upgrade that system to a 14900K for way too much money? And then you've got to have a decent motherboard that can deliver the power, and then you upgrade your cooling, and it's not a practical or feasible solution.
Yeah,
And really, if you're talking about 12th gen, if you're going back and going, okay, I'm going to build a new computer or upgrade my whole platform, I'm looking at 12th gen. Really, the comparison in terms of value would be something like a 5700X 3D, like AM4, which is going to win
exactly.
that
Yeah.
value argument. So,
In fact, I was just looking at that sort of comparison, right? Because we're talking effectively about two dead platforms there. 12th gen on the dead platform,
there'll be more
AM4 on the
AM4
dead.
bin
Well,
CPUs to come, Tim.
sure. But like a Ryzen 5 5600 right now is $120. So it's a
Yeah.
little cheaper than the 12400.
Mhm.
And this 5700 XTD, I think you can get those for $230. So again, like the 5700 XTD is going to outperform the 12400 and a lot of those 12th gen parts. But like there's even the option to enter the dead platform with a 5600 for a very low price, then upgrade to a 5700 XTD potentially on the used market later. And that's like, you know, it's a pretty compelling offering if you're after those sort of very cheap budget sort of offerings. So this is why I've come to this opinion that I think that Intel has, just they don't really have any viable gaming options. AMD is pretty much offering something to most buyers that I can see. They've got the outright fastest gaming CPU for people that want the best of the best. They've got great options that I think are quite affordable, around $200, that are on a currently supported platform that offer you that upgrade path. And then for the very entry level budget buys, AM4 is in a really good position. Not that we've talked about not necessarily recommending it for people wanting to build like an entirely new system. But if you want the cheapest parts, like they're dirt
that's
cheap
right.
options.
You can get a viable B550 motherboard for about $90. And you can get 32 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 for $50. So you're talking about
great value.
$150 motherboard memory combo with 32 gigabytes, $150, and then chuck the CPU in there. You can basically do it for $300 with a 8-core CPU, like not the X3D part, but one of the non.
Yeah.
So
a part that would be competitive with Intel's cheaper options for sure.
Certainly comparable, yeah. Very, very competitive. So that's, it's tough to beat.
Yeah, it's put them in sort of an interesting position where they have to think about now how they're going to win gamers back. And I think, though, as we've talked about in previous episodes, it's the Ryzen first gen strategy. That's the position that Intel are currently in. That's what they need to target is, the reason why first generation Ryzen was so successful wasn't, at least in my opinion, because they offered much more multi-core performance. That was a component at the time that assisted them, but the real winner was how cheap the parts were, especially a couple of months, 6 months, a year into those generations, and especially as you started to get more and more generations launch, which pushed the price down of the older generations. So Arrow Lake just needs to be cheaper.
And to the degree that I just don't think they can do it. I mean, can they, the 245K, can they slash that down to like $200? I think if you were tossing up between a 7600 and a 245K, I mean, if you're strictly gaming, though, I think it turned out that the gaming performance between those two chips overall, at least in its current condition, is fairly competitive. I'm just going to bring up one of my graphs right now, Tim. So the
I think it's slower.
The 245K is definitely slower than a 5600 non-X.
7600 non-X.
7600 non-X, thanks. It's basically the same performance that you get out of a 12th gen part. So the 12600K is looking mighty slow these days compared to a 7600X. That margins seems to have really opened up. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
I'd have to go back and I'd have to go back and have a look at some of the earlier benchmarks to see what we were actually expecting there.
I mean, I think the 12600K at launch was still behind like the 5800 X3 and those sort of models, because I was just looking at that performance.
I thought they were pretty competitive, but foggy memory light. For some reason, my
I was looking at the Ryzen 5 7600 review, and you definitely had, at least in that review, the 12600K behind the 5800 X3D. The 13600K was up there with the 5800 X3D. That was more than a year ago now.
Well, the games have definitely gotten a bit more. It looks probably fairly similar actually. Maybe it's widened a tiny bit, but the 7600X was faster than the 12600K by a larger margin than I recall.
Which we were looking at that sort of performance data just now for the 245K, right? And we found that it's slower than AMD's existing Zen 4 models, like the 7600, and the 7600 is selling for $200, like just under $200. The 245K is $320 on Newegg at the moment. Like, how cheap does that have to be? Does it have to be half the price to get people to consider buying that for gaming builds? Like, that's the position that they're in, right? Like, you wouldn't consider it at $200 because it's still slower than the AMD part, and the upgrade path is questionable. And then you're starting to have to talk about it being $150, $120 CPU, and it's $320 right now.
Yeah, and
that's not a good position.
What's wild is, if you're in the US, I mean, the deals still apply in Australia. It's just we're talking a different currency. But right now, you can hop on AliExpress, which I don't normally recommend buying PC-related parts like motherboards off AliExpress just because of warranty concerns and that. But CPUs are generally a pretty safe, pretty easy purchase to make. You can buy a 7500F, which is a 7600 without the iGPU, for $115 delivered to your door.
Is that a legit CPU? Because that's pretty cheap.
Yeah, I've personally purchased about half a dozen of these myself because they're so cheap.
Nice.
I've used them around the office and upgraded my wife's PC and stuff like that with them, and they're fine. So you can buy a 7500F. It works out in Australia dollars to be 180 Australian dollars. You can land them for that's a sort of a separate thing, but there isn't a hack, let's say, like that for. Well, certainly not for Arrow Lake, and there isn't one for any of the LGA 1700 CPUs either. So, I mean, if you're looking for an absolute bargain, I've heard that there's Ryzen 7 CPUs as well, cheap on AliExpress. But yeah, if you're looking for something absolutely dirt cheap, 7500F. I don't know why the 7500F is plentiful on AliExpress and nowhere else. Obviously, Chinese market got more of them, but that deal's been running for a year now or something, quite a long time. Whereas,
that's crazy. I mean, I've just been looking at Australian prices to see, like, is this a US phenomenon? Is there just no viable Intel options and it's only in the US because of pricing reasons? But it's almost even worse here in Australia.
It is,
I've just been looking. Ryzen 5 5600 is $155 at PCK Gear. The cheapest 12th gen CPU is the 12400F at $165. So again, like, the cheapest AM4 CPU is cheaper. And then you've got options, obviously, like the 5700 XUD here in Australia, that's 350 Australian dollars, which again is going to be beating parts like a 12600K, which is $300. It's sold out at the moment. The 245K here locally and the 245KF. So if you want to get the cheapest Arrow Lake part, is $500 Australian. And for that, like, the 7600X is selling for the 7600, is selling for $288 at PCK Gear. So it's approaching, the 7600 is approaching half the price. It's not quite there. It needs another $40 off, and then it's half the price.
Well, the other nail in the Arrow Lake coffin right now is the fact that the cheapest motherboard in Australian dollars is $460. The Z890 UD from Gigabyte. It's the Wi-Fi 6E model. I've actually tested that board. VRM was fine, but $460 for the cheapest board.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So,
especially considering, as we talked about, the 245K delivers performance that's in the ballpark of AM4 CPUs on a platform with questionable upgrades. So we're talking about, like, the motherboard alone is probably going to be
more than twice what you pay for a B6. It's more than twice the price you'll pay for a good B650 board.
Yeah. So again, like, what was the price of a good B650 board? You're saying like $200 Australian-ish?
$200 you can absolutely get one for. They're $170 to $200 in that range.
So you can buy the motherboard and a product like a Ryzen 5 5600, which is $155, for less than the cost of the cheapest Z790 motherboard that you need for Arrow Lake now. Z890 motherboard that you need for Arrow Lake right now, and the performance is similar.
Yep.
Like, that's not good.
That's why they're not selling. But again, it circles back to our earlier discussion that there's a lot of those motherboards to pick from. They're all stinking expensive, but there's an unexplainably overwhelmingly large amount of these boards for sale. But anyway, that's the situation.
Yeah. So a lot of things are going to need to improve from Intel's side of things to get their CPU division in a better position. And, at least one perspective is potentially they didn't make too many of the Arrow Lake processors, the 285K selling out, despite at least the reception that we're hearing is that not many people are, flooding out to buy them. If they haven't produced too many of them, they're not going to be in this huge loss position where they're having to suddenly get rid of a whole bunch of them, because if you just don't make them, then there's no need to do any fire sales. And hopefully with some sort of reset in future generations, they'll be able to get back to the the basics that make people buy boxed CPUs, which again I think is generally gaming performance.
Mm-hmm.
And we see, just better pricing and things like that, which, there needs to be competition. The good news, at least for consumers as things stand right now, is that if you do want an affordable, value-oriented CPU, AMD is not necessarily taking their dominant position and just giving you trash options. There still appears to be plenty of CPUs across the lineup that are good value. But if you get a few more generations of that, there's every chance that that sort of thing erodes. So you don't want to have AMD or Intel or any brand go generation after generation being in this hugely, leadership position for ages. Like, that's great for AMD executives and their paychecks and stuff, but for general consumers, competition is obviously the way. So I think that pretty much does it for a little recap of the 9800 XG, unless you had any other final thoughts on the part and things to talk about.
No, one thing this morning I actually wanted to tell you, because you'll get a laugh out of it, and I couldn't believe the current state of affairs, but I also probably shouldn't be surprised. You probably saw my series of tweets talking about low resolution. So that I actually didn't want to talk about that, but we can touch on it because I felt sorry for hardware Canucks, but we'll circle back to that. But one thing that I found absolutely hilarious and also mind-blowing at the same time was I saw multiple people in our YouTube comment section and on X claiming that low-resolution benchmarks are just a thing YouTubers use to hype up products, and but wait, and that their 14900K is as fast as a 9800X 3D for gaming and faster for productivity. So the icing on the cake, the awesome part about this whole statement is this is Core i9 14900K owners now saying that low resolution benchmarks are misleading. How good is that? And just to be clear, if you've got a 14900K, that thing is perfectly fine. That is a fast gaming CPU. You need not worry about the 9800X 3D. Yes, the 9800X 3D is hands down the better product. Yes, you would only consider buying the 9800X 3D if you were building a computer today. But if you have a 14900K, don't feel insecure. It is a perfectly fine CPU in terms of gaming performance. Yeah, it's a power-hungry pig, but it performs well.
Yeah.
But
so I guess for people,
that's like some next level cope, isn't it? Like attacking.
So for people wondering why we're saying this, right? It's because Intel CPU owners, at least I shouldn't say owners, Intel fanboys.
Yeah, it's more accurate.
Were the champions of low resolution testing during the Ryzen era. For the whole time, there was all this discussion of, Intel CPUs will look even better if you test at 720p low settings.
You couldn't
or whatever.
go low enough.
That's right. You could not go low enough. So to have that flip now and the opposite as well was Ryzen fanboys. Their position was that low resolution testing is misleading and you need to test at 1440p or 4K. And to see that completely flip as soon, it's like, if you want the perfect example of how these fanboys are not objective in their thinking, they're not open-minded individuals. This is the perfect example of this. Perfect example.
Yeah,
because
I laughed.
If you're looking at it objectively, you cannot hold. It's incredible. You can't hold both those positions. But lo and behold, cult-like behavior has come out in full force. People just want to defend whatever preconceived ideas that they've got about their brand, and we're seeing it. And let's be honest, you and I, we're both kind of laughing at it because it's pretty effing funny.
Yeah, it's something special, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And then obviously there was a lot of people complaining about low resolution testing anyway, and they're not fanboys. They're just either a bit misguided, misinformed, or just sort of misunderstand is the best way to put it. But the reason I actually delve into those waters once again, knowing that my feeble attempts of trying to educate people on this subject were just that, I went over to the Hardware Canucks review. So I was checking out everyone's reviews, seeing what they had to say, see what their results were like. And Hardware Canucks advertised that they'd tested at 1440p and that was showing the true potential. I think they at 1440p they showed the same margins we saw at 1080p, which probably
You mean it's
speaks to
720p?
sorry, 720.
Yeah.
Far out. Let me start again. They tested at 720p and 1080p. I don't actually know what I said originally. I think it said 1440p, but I meant 720p. They're very different resolutions, by the way, if you were unaware. And anyway, they had also included, as I said, 1080p, but they were advertising that they'd gone and done additional testing at 720p because that highlights the difference by reducing system and GPU bottlenecks further. It's all fine, okay? That's no issues with that. But they were getting bludgeoned in the comment section of their own video. I think when I watched their video, they had about 90 comments, and I think 50 of them were calling them clowns. Like, the aggression was next level. There was people saying, like, yeah, you guys are clowns. 720p, this is ridiculous. It's 2024. Yeah, you can go to their video right now and bring up the comments. Like, it's insane. What they were saying in the comments. Actually, I'll sample you some real comments, so it's not me making up stuff.
Okay.
Are you ready, Tim?
Yeah.
You sound like you're ready. 720p results are purely academic. No one will ever play at that resolution realistically. Come on with these reviews and these decade-old resolutions. Who runs a $1,500 graphics card with a $300 monitor? So you get the idea. There were much more aggressive ones that were full on abusing them. I don't know if they got deleted or the YouTube filter got them. This one's like, brother, this is in all caps. Brother, who will put this 9800X3 and RTX 4090 for 720p and 1080p gaming? So you get the idea. Anyway, there was a heap of bashing them, and I saw the Hardware Canucks guys addressing some of them. Another one here, 720p, how stupid. And then I saw quite a few people praising the LTT review in the Hardware Canucks comment section, saying that at least they know how to review CPUs. They included 1440p and 4K benchmarks, which are the only relevant resolutions for such a high-end CPU. So I thought that's interesting. I'll go over and have a look at the Linus Tech Tips review because I actually hadn't got to their review yet. I was saving that one for just about last. So I went over, perfectly fine review as far as I could tell, but they did include 4K benchmarks, and they had that. They even titled it like GPU limited testing, which they're being transparent about it, but I still feel like it is misleading because people do exactly what they're saying. They're like, well, it's no faster at 1440p and 4K, therefore I don't need it. Which I'm not trying to sell you on it anyway, but that's just wrong. Like, you're getting the wrong messaging. You're misinterpreting it from start to finish. And one of the Linus Tech Tips 4K benchmarks was in Black Myth Wukong, and they tested the 5800X3D, the 7800X3D, and the 9800X3D, and all three of them were capped at 45 frames per second. Now, that graph is worthless. It's worthless on all accounts. First of all, even if you're happy with 45 frames per second at 4K, it's still kind of useless to a degree, but that's about the only scenario where you could make an argument for it being somewhat useful. But again, if you know that using the cinematic preset at 4K with all the bells and whistles turned on, an RTX 4090 only renders 45 frames per second, you've learnt that information from the GPU benchmark or a Black Myth Wukong test. And if you know the CPUs can render more than 45 frames per second, it's an irrelevant thing. But if you want more than 45 frames per second in Black Myth Wukong, you're not going to be playing at 4K with a cinematic preset. You're going to enable probably some sort of upscaling. You're probably going to downgrade some of the quality settings, and you're going to do so until you get a frame rate that you're happy with. And we people tell me, but people don't target frame rates. They target quality settings, and they're like, within reason, like, you don't want 2 FPS. It's like, well, if you don't want 2 FPS, how many FPS do you want? And if the answer is more than 45, then the graph is completely pointless. Like, I can't play a single player game like Black Myth Wukong with less than 90 FPS as my base frame rate. not taking into account frame generation. Like I want a minimum on my high refresh rate panel. I want a minimum of 90, and countless people, when I say that in the comment section, agree with me. And I think we've done polls before that suggest that people like comfortably over 60 FPS PC gamers.
Yep.
And all of this information you can learn from the 1080p testing. Like you want to know, but I think all of this boils down to probably you can put it into three categories. Like one would be people not understanding what a CPU review is and what you're actually meant to be getting out of the CPU review. Then there are people who want to be or don't want to be. They're either on one side of the fence, but they're in agreement on why they want 1440p and 4K. Is that they either want to find out whether they need an upgrade. Like I play at 1440p, so I want to know what is this offering me at 1440p? Should I upgrade? And then there are the other people like the Intel guys we spoke about at the start with the 1400Ks that are sort of in copium land, and they don't want to feel inferior with their CPUs. They want to see GPU limited CPU benchmarking. But again, that's not. First of all, that's not what a CPU review is or should be, and that's also not how any of this works. It's not how you buy a CPU, and it's not how you work out if you need to upgrade your CPU. So you're doing it all wrong. And it's very, very, very simple. First of all, you have your computer that you play your games on, and you're getting a frame rate. Are you happy with the performance or not? It feels a bit laggy, it's a bit sluggish. I would like more performance, and I have a chunk of money to spend to get the more performance. Okay, great. That's step one. What needs to be upgraded? Your CPU or your GPU or the whole bloody thing? So quickest way to work that out is fire up something like Riva Tuner, look at your GPU usage. Is it comfortably below, say, 95%? And then play around with the quality settings and work out what's happening, like lower your resolution and, does that change anything? And work out whether you are CPU or GPU limited and to what degree. So once you've worked that out, you're seeing your new 4070 Ti Super, it's at like 50% utilization. And, you try increasing the resolution does help with utilization, but you still can't max it out and you can't achieve the frame rates you want. You do a bit of research, what game you're playing, this card should be able to achieve that FPS. So you've worked out you need a CPU upgrade, right? Now, you don't need to work out what CPU is the best CPU for 1440p or 4K because it's not a thing. It's just not a thing. What you need to do is you need to go, $300 is what I typically spend on my CPU, and that's what I want to spend on my CPU. Okay, great. Now you go to reviews and you work out which $300-ish CPU delivers you the best performance. And you determine that by looking at CPU limited testing. And that's it. You don't go, the $300 CPU is 20% slower than a 9800X 3D at 1080p. Should I spend another, $200 US? Because then it's a different price tier, and then you've got to work out what the best CPU is at that price tier. So
I think the first question that most people want from a review, and again, it goes into the whole, this isn't what a review is doing, is they want the number that's shown to equal the performance that they get in their system. So there's, even with things like GPU reviews, there's at times not a willingness to compare percentage differences between parts.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much, I want the review to show the number I will get.
Mm-hmm.
And so even with GPU reviews, you kind of see the reverse situation where people are asking you, you shouldn't be testing an RTX 4060 on a 7800X3D. You should be testing that on a lower tier CPU because people don't pair $500 CPUs with $300 GPUs. So you get the reverse because people want the exact configuration that they're playing to get the number that they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas how we're suggesting that you should interpret reviews is, firstly, percentage differences are more important than the actual number that you're getting. So if you've chosen a price point that you're considering paying, don't be thinking, let's have a look, 120 or 150. It's like, which part is 20% faster, 30% faster? You should be using the data that we're providing so that you can make those, performance comparisons. So we're not going to give you all the percentage differences in every single review. You might need to do some calculations. And so with CPU reviews, I think there's a misconception that CPUs work like GPUs, in that with a GPU, if you lower the resolution, your performance improves. So generally speaking, 4K, you turn it down to 1080p, FPS goes up. CPUs don't work like that. If you're CPU limited and you play at 4K and you reduce the resolution to 1080p, in most games you will see a negligible performance difference. You might see a small reduction or a small improvement in FPS from the lower resolution, but generally speaking, it doesn't make a difference. And that's because CPUs are not the primary thing. They're not resolution dependent. The reason why games are CPU limited is not due to the amount of pixels that are trying to be rendered in the game. It's due to things like the game logic, all those sorts of things. It's a completely different method of rendering. And so I think this is what confuses a lot of people, is that people think that, well, I'm buying a CPU for 4K gaming. Therefore, performance will be much lower on the CPU, so I don't need to worry about as much the CPU because, it's a different resolution. Like, it's surely I'm going to be more on the GPU side and things like that. Whereas I think what those people fail to understand is that CPUs provide a baseline. And this is what you've been really trying to get to in your sort of videos, talking about why you test CPUs at 1080p and why CPUs also matter for 4K gaming, is that the CPU sets the maximum frame rate that you'll be able to get in a game. And so all the decisions around the GPU, the performance, the quality settings, the games you play, all that sort of thing is set by the CPU as a very hard limit. There is little that you can do in games to change that sort of limit. Whereas with the GPU, lots of things you can change. Resolution, quality settings. There's many more levers you can pull to adjust the level of output performance that you get. With CPU, if the CPU can do 120 FPS, that's it. That's the limit. It's very unlikely you'll be able to turn down settings and put that to 140 FPS. The CPU just does 120. That's it. That's what you're getting. And so with your examples, we're talking about people upgrading their systems and things like that, and you're having to figure out like, I'm only getting 60 FPS in this game. I would love to be getting 120 FPS. You might determine that you need a faster GPU. So then you buy the faster GPU that's good for 120 FPS. Like, you've watched the reviews in the game that you play, you're going to be getting double the performance. But then it turns out that the CPU you bought is capped at 100 FPS. You're never going to get 120 FPS no matter what GPU you put in. And this is where people can make mistakes by looking at those 1440p benchmarks. Is that if you look at the 1440p benchmark and all CPUs are at 80 FPS, you will never figure out the limits 100 FPS. You'll upgrade your GPU in search of 120 FPS. The 100 FPS limit's exposed. You've wasted money on the GPU. You should have upgraded the CPU. And that's exactly why you should be looking at 1080p benchmarks, because they find the limit. They find what your performance can be. And so that tells you everything that you need to know.
Yeah. And the inverse of that is you could have, in that scenario, lowered your resolution or lowered your quality settings and found that your performance doesn't improve because that cap, as you say, was set by the CPU. Now that straight away tells you that you've significantly lightened the GPU load and yet performance doesn't improve. That is a clear indicator that there is some other kind of system bottleneck, usually a CPU bottleneck. But then also adding to all of this, and this is why I say step one, work out, do you need a new CPU? I'm not telling you that. It's not in the reviewers. I'm not trying to convince you that your CPU sucks and you need a 9800X3D. I'm merely showing you what the 9800X3D has to offer relative to other CPUs. Step one, work out, do you need a CPU upgrade? Step two, how much would you like to invest in that CPU upgrade? And work that out. And then the other component to the CPU upgrade and why it's good to know the actual gaming performance difference between the CPUs is because you're not keeping the CPU for 10 minutes. You're not going to upgrade the CPU with the next video game that comes out that's more demanding. You're not wanting to upgrade the CPU if you happen to upgrade your GPU, as Tim's saying, in 6 months to a much faster one, and then you find out, that CPU upgrade, I didn't pick the best CPU in terms of performance, and now I'm missing out on 20% performance. If I had that extra 20% performance, I wouldn't need to upgrade my CPU right now. So you want to get the best value CPU, so the best performance CPU at a price you're willing to spend now, because it will last the longest. And even if you're not able to leverage the full uplift that you see at 1080p, at some point in time, that performance difference will be realized. So if you bought a 5800X, or let's say you had the option of buying a 5800X or a 5800X 3D. I think in some instances, the 5800X 3D is up to like 40% faster. I'd have to look at the latest data on that, but it's substantially faster. Now, if you had been tossing up between those two CPUs back when the 5800X 3D was initially released, and admittedly it was quite a bit more expensive, but a lot of people would have said the 5800X 3D is not worth it because at 1440p Ultra or 4K Ultra with my GPU, there's only like a 10% performance improvement, so it's not worth paying whatever, let's say it was 50% more expensive, which admittedly, they're ratios that you have to work out. But fast forward to today, and you play a game like Starfield, Hogwarts Legacy, what are all the other more... Black Myth Wukong's not a good example because that's not very CPU heavy, but if you play one of the many very CPU limited modern AAA titles, and there's plenty coming up, with that CPU, you will find today that the 5800X 3D under real world conditions is much faster than the 5800X. And especially if over that period of time you've upgraded your GPU, that will basically amplify that difference. So
yeah, I think people, in your plan of how you go through and set, how you should be choosing to buy a CPU, I think people get caught up on you need to choose a price, because I think a lot of people, when they're looking at the GPU limited benchmarks or whatever, are trying to understand, like, how much do I actually need to spend? Like, do I need to spend $300? Do I need to spend $200? And do I need to spend $100? And so people try and use those GPU limited benchmarks to justify spending as little as possible, basically. They sort of go and they look at the charts and they're like, okay, well, there's no real performance difference between the $500 CPU and the $200 CPU, so I'll just buy the $200 CPU. So they'll kind of do the reverse of what you're suggesting. They're looking at the wrong sort of numbers. But if you're struggling to figure out the dollar number that you should spend, all you have to be thinking about is what performance do I want to be capped at? Very simple.
There's that. Sorry to interrupt you, but you can also work out the value based on the cost per frame, which is why we include that.
Yeah.
So if you're like under these more CPU limited scenarios, the 7600X is substantially better value than a 9800X 3D. And yeah, the average frame rate lowers by almost 50 FPS, or just over 50 FPS actually. But there's not, for a lot of gaming scenarios, there's not a huge amount of difference. There's probably going to be less of a difference at the resolutions I'm playing, and I can spend half as much money. Now, in the future, as I'm saying, those margins will become more commonplace, but you've spent less than half as much money. So it's always... This applies to everything. Sorry, I've completely hijacked this, Tim, but this applies to everything, right? You only buy the best of the best, the premium flagship products, if you have the money or the means or the justification to do so, okay? However it works in your world. If you're like, I want to spend a stupid amount of money on this thing, and yes, it will last a bit longer. I think I talked about this on the last podcast with the 1080 Ti. It'll last longer, but it won't last longer as a high-end product. Yeah. So my advice is always buy within your means, as long as you're getting a good value product, but spend what you're comfortable spending. And if you're comfortable spending $200 US on a CPU, the 9800X 3D doesn't exist. It's like if you're buying a car and you're spending $40,000, the $80,000 cars don't exist. Ignore them. It's just noise. You buy within your budget. So if it's $200, we're saying get a 7600X, not a 12600K, because the 7600X is much better value with what it offers. And it's the same thing, like you wouldn't buy, you might go, oh yeah, but the Core i9 12100K has been discounted. That used to be $600 and now it's in the $200 range. It's only, if I stretch my budget by like $70, I could get, a 12900K. But you're spending substantially more money for the same gaming performance. So although it sounds great getting a Core i9, you're better off with the 7600X. And this is what the cost per frame stuff all shows. So I like to think we bring it all together in the review to show you what the best value, and the 9800X 3D is mid-tier. It's mid-tier in terms of value. It is effectively worse value at these heavily CPU limited benchmarks than a 9700X. It's much worse value than a 7700X. So if that information was absent from our review, I guess you could make sort of that argument but we're not trying to upsell you on a 9800X 3D. We're showing you that it's actually not particularly great value compared to those cheaper parts. But if you want the best of the best and you compare it to the other best of the best, or best class type, top tier flagship type products, it is worth buying. So yeah, sorry, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely applies to quite a few buyers that, if you want the value part, look at the cost per frame graph. I still think there are people who are very unsure on how much money they want to spend on parts. So they're not necessarily in like a budget category or a high end. They don't really fit into a category. It's like more just they're trying to figure it out. They might not have ever built a PC before. They don't really know like how much you should allocate on that part or whatever. In which case, again, like my recommendation, if you're not sure on your budget, you haven't decided how much to spend on a CPU, you just have to think about the limits that you want. You have to sort of think like, well, the lower tier parts are going to be better value, but they're not going to be as performant. The higher tier parts are going to be less good value, but they're going to be faster. So it's just about thinking about that limit that you want to go with, really. Like there's no good answer to that problem. But the answer I know for sure is not the answer, is looking at GPU limited benchmarks. GPU limited benchmarks should not be what is determining the amount that you spend on a CPU. You should be still looking at what is the ultimate performance that these parts can bring, and then figuring out where your limit is, like what you're comfortable with, even if theoretically you're not going to actually achieve that performance in the real world due to GPU bottlenecks or whatever. You go, okay, I'm comfortable with this level of performance. That level of performance is available at this price, so that should be my price point. If you haven't decided your price point yet, that's how you should be going about it. Not looking at 1440p or 4K benchmarks and going, all these CPUs are the same, therefore I'll buy the cheapest one. Because again, you just don't know what you'll be doing in the future, and you should always be trying to buy the best product at the price that you've ultimately settled on.
Yeah, and I know even in the comment section of this podcast, when it's on YouTube, there'll be people who are arguing that we're wrong and we don't understand. And it's like, no, there'll even be arguments that like for the newer buyers, like it's good to see that you don't need to buy a 9800X 3D and stuff like that. But it's worse showing GPU limited benchmarks. That is more of a trap, right? If you accidentally spend more money than maybe you needed to for the games you're playing and you buy a 9800X 3D, you've not been screwed over. Like it's going to ensure that you have an amazing gaming experience now and well into the future. But another example, and I might even make a video doing this because this could be a fun experiment. So if I picked, let's just go with 3 CPUs, right, off the top of my head. I picked 3 CPUs and I don't tell you what they are, okay? And I benchmark them in games that are a few years old at 1440p and 4K. And I do so in a similar vein to the way that Linus Tech Tips did it. So heavily GPU limited or just GPU limited benchmarks, okay? And the CPUs are called CPU 1 or CPU A, CPU 2, CPU 3, right? And one of them costs $230, one of them costs $210, and the other one's $230. And they all deliver the exact same performance. One of them is an 8000 series part, one of them is a 5000 series part, and one of them is a 7000 series part. I did that out of order because I'm just trying to confuse you. Which one do you buy, Tim? They're all the same performance. you're a novice buyer. What are you going to buy? Do you buy the 8000 series part?
Well, you just buy the cheapest one, wouldn't you?
Well, it's only $20 difference. So the 5000 series part's $230, the 7000 series part's $210, and the 8000 series part's $230. So they're all much of a muchness. Like the cost essentially works out to be nothing. So you're sitting there going, okay, well, the price is much the same, the performance is much the same. I get the newer thing, right? That would be my logic. Is that going to be the logic of most people?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of under the assumption that you hadn't revealed which of the CPUs which generation or whichever. So if you're just going CPU 1, 2, and 3 at those prices, it's like there's no information to go on at all. So it would just be like a lotto, effectively.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, you're right. You would pick the cheapest. So if the only information revealed was the generation, let's say,
then you get the newest generation.
Ultimately, where I'm going with this, I skipped a step. Ultimately, where I'm going with this, I'll actually tell you what the CPUs are. And again, if you're a novice builder, it's probably not going to mean too much to you. Okay. But okay, so step one, you're absolutely right. Sorry. You pick the cheapest CPU. Okay. So in this sense, that actually works out to be probably of benefit. I could have come up with a different combination of CPUs, mind you, like there's limitless examples here. But let's say the other bit of information is the CPU model. So one's like an 8600, so that would be like the 8600G, so an 8000 series Ryzen processor, which if you're a novice builder, the assumption would have to be that that's better than a 7000 series or a 5000 series processor. I think that makes sense. So at the moment, the 8600G is $230 US. The 7600X is $210. And the 5700X 3D is $230. Now, of those CPUs, I would actually recommend the cheapest one, which is the 7600X. So you would have picked wisely if you had have gone with the cheapest processor. But if you were to go off model names and 8000 being better than 7000, then you might get the 8600G.
Well, you could just claim they're all the same. Like in a theoretical scenario, you just say, well, they're all about the same price. Generally, you would just buy the newest model, the 8000 model.
It doesn't really matter. Essentially, you're going in blindfolded, right? Or at the very least, heavily misguided. So you've got 3 CPUs, 3 different generations, 3 different names, 3 very different CPUs, the way they go about doing things, similar price points, very different gaming performance. The 5700X 3D and 7600X are probably the most similar. But I guess my point is, if you test them at 45 or 60 FPS or even 70 FPS, if that was to say be the cap at 4K ultra type settings, the conclusion is they're all much the same. So just get whichever one's the cheapest in your region, or realistically probably buy the new one because it's the new one. But I'm pretty confident if you do those benchmarks, the 8600G is going to be quite a bit slower than the 7600X and is going to bottleneck you much earlier. So it might be an interesting video to test those 3 CPUs in games from a couple of years ago at the 1440p 4K GPU limited benchmarks, and also see how they would have compared back then at, say, 1080p, which I'm sure we already have the data for, and then make that comparison today with even more demanding games with maybe a slightly higher end GPU using reasonable quality settings, and just see. Because I like, how many frames per second is an 8600G going to do in Starfield? I actually don't have the answer for you.
It wouldn't be good. Not more than double digits.
No, well, a 7600X does 100 frames on the dot, basically, with 82 for the 1% lows.
Yeah, it's in the doubles.
The 5800X 3Ds, well, the 5700X 3D would be more like 90 FPS. I've got to think the 8600G would be slower than that. So that means if you bought the 8600G today, it would be substantially slower than a 7600X in a game like Starfield. But I'd have to do that testing. But that's just one random example I've plucked out of thin air. So there's probably some better CPU matchups that you could go back a couple of years and pick 2 CPUs of roughly similar value. But again, as I said, this it's so much more than that because it applies to CPUs of different price ranges as well. Like,
Yeah.
there might be a CPU that's $50 or $60 more that you didn't consider because you're not paying $50 or $60 more for no extra performance. But then you get a year or two down the track, and then this thing ends up being 30% faster. You probably wish you had to spent the extra money because then
Yeah, I mean, I think the GPU limited benchmarks almost always get people to buy a slower, cheaper CPU. You're not looking at a GPU limited benchmark and being like, "Hey, 9800 XUD is for me." It's definitely convincing people to buy a slower part. The question is how bad of a decision is that in general, and I think that sort of testing would definitely show that if you were looking at the time 2 or 3 years ago that those GPU limited benchmarks, you definitely would have been misled because the performance that you see a couple of years later is going to be different, where the real differences between the parts are going to be exposed more, even at realistic settings. But yeah, like I totally agree with you when it comes to, it's not that the 1440p and 4K data is inaccurate or wrong. Like it's correct data, it's accurate data. However, showing that can be worse than not showing it. It's like a data
it's misleading at
presentation
best.
thing.
It is absolutely
Yeah.
misleading at best.
It goes beyond misleading though. It's like it's worse in my opinion to show it. If you've got someone looking at a review who's very interested in sort of the whole, as we've talked about, I want to look at the performance I'll get in my setup, the FPS number, I want that to match, then the person's going to ignore all of the better data and they're going to focus on the bad data. And so, whilst again it's accurate, it's bad to have it in there. It's worse for the video. It's worse for the presentation to have it there because we're trying to, I guess, like encourage people to look at the data properly, to sort of look at things that make the most sense for this testing. So we could show in reviews all sorts of different things that are ultimately irrelevant to the CPU and its performance and various different things. But we want to be focused and make sure that the takeaway that you have from a review is the important things. And if we're clogging up the review with all sorts of other stuff that could potentially sway you in ways that aren't worth being swayed over, like GPU limited benchmarking, then yeah, that does a disservice to people. And we have a lot of discussions. Like how many times have we thought about how we present things like the benchmark charts, how they're visually presented to make it easy for people to read and understand things. And we get a lot of people asking us to show things like frame time plots as opposed to looking at average FPS and 1% loads, because the thinking is that the frame time chart, which you see all the different spikes and things, it can show you things that FPS numbers and averages don't necessarily show you. That's definitely true. But I personally, and I think a lot of people, find it extremely difficult to read an FPS frame time plot. Like they are just unbelievably difficult to understand the performance differences between products when you look at that sort of chart, which is why we don't show them. Because at least in my opinion, it's kind of worthless information. Like it's not worthless information, but it's not very useful. If getting information easily, quickly, that you can look at a glance and figure out what's better is the whole goal of our channel at Hardware Unboxed and why we present data in the way that we're presenting. So if we're showing you charts that are not useful, they're accurate, but they're not useful, they may let you have an opinion of a product that's actually going to lead you to buy a product that's worse. We're going to omit the data. And so that's why we don't show it.
Yep.
It's as simple as that. So yeah, that is CPU limited testing. I'm sure people in the comments will be like, you talk about this a lot, but I don't know. It seems like every single review, it comes up again. For one reason or another, the whole, why don't you show this? Why don't you show that? So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people say, oh, you're being condescending or patronizing or whatever when I say, it's a bit mind numbing, but you're really just not understanding what it is that you want and what you're looking at and how to get it. And there's really while it would be like, I get it, right? While it would be lovely to say, here's my computer and here is my game, if I stick this CPU in, how much better will it be? And then if I stick in this CPU that costs a bit more, how much better will it be? And then I can work out which one I want. I get that, But that is, first of all, while that would be the most optimal way to go about it, the reviews aren't designed or can't cater to your exact specific use case, because you play Space Marine at a certain resolution with or without certain upscaling technologies enabled, with certain quality settings, because you're happy with a certain frame rate. So what CPU will offer you the best value to achieve that frame rate depends. But then it also depends, like, it, as we said, the future thing, we're not saying like which buy for the future or future proofing or anything like that. But really, you just want to get the best value processor at a certain price point to deliver that performance. So you can go and find out what performance, the CPUs are capable of delivering in Space Marine at 1080p, and go, well, I would like that performance. I would like 100 FPS, not 80. So the ones that can't deliver 100 FPS are naturally out, and then you work your way up from there, which I'm repeating myself, but it really is a very simple concept. And ultimately, what you need to know is how they actually differ, in how the CPU, to determine CPU performance, you need to look at CPU performance. I know it's wild, but that's the situation. And yeah, I'm not sure what more to say about it. I know that there's no way to head off all the different arguments around this subject. But I guess on a final note, the thing that I find most frustrating about this, and I guess this is just the human race or just online, is that I'm interested in cars. I like cars, right? And I do a bit of car research, but I don't go to a car forum where there's like mechanics and guys that do this stuff day in, day out and be like, oh, but you're wrong because my opinion, you know what I mean? Like, I'll go and listen to what the experts, and we never really claim to be experts, but we're probably more so than a lot of people that talk about these subjects. I go and listen to what they have to say and go, okay. And then I might get the opinion of another mechanic, and then I might get the opinion of an engineer and someone else. And if all of them, if like 90 something % of them are saying the same thing, they're handling it in the same manner, then I'm probably like, well, that seems pretty conclusive. That's how they're doing it. And if you go to any of the top tier tech websites, if you go to Gamers Nexus, obviously Hardware Unboxed, and the countless other, Hardware Canucks that I spoke of, and they're all testing in this way, I mean, right away that would tell me something. I'd be like, oh, well, maybe the way I want to see it presented isn't actually the best way to give me that information, or maybe I'm not actually getting what I think I'm getting by viewing that information. The guys that there'll be so many, I see the trap as well. There's YouTubers that test at 1440p and 4K, and we have done that ourselves. And again, I've stopped doing it. We did it briefly as sort of a trial period because it was just an overwhelming amount of people that were requesting that information. We like to give the viewers what they want. But I just got to the point where I'm like, we're actually contributing to the problem here. And I do honestly believe it's more harmful than anything else. It's misleading at best, is the way I've phrased it multiple times. So I made the decision to stop doing it a little while ago. People were upset about that, but I'm sticking to it. I'm not. It's kind of like, I know it's a situation where like, I think I know best for you, but in this situation, my 20 plus years of experience and seeing how these things evolve over time and how the industry keeps moving forward and what impact that has on the products, I know this is the right way of doing it. And again, I'm not going out on a limb here. We're not doing it our way because we think our way is the best way. It's actually been a long-term established way of testing, and everyone who knows their stuff does it that way. So again, that should tell you something. That should cause pause before you go to the comments and go, "No, you're wrong," and then give an explanation that paints a picture where you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So, but again, it's the internet. That's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, we don't decide these things on a whim. It's not. It's not like we're lazy for not showing you the data because we haven't tested. We can't be bothered testing it, or we present our graphs in a certain way and omit other things because we just randomly have decided to do it that way. It's, we have refined it over many years to show you the data in what we think is the most easiest, best way to present things. And we show you all the things that I think are the most relevant in the review. Like there's just
And we also, if you're like, oh, but people who don't know or they're new or whatever, it's like, yeah, okay, well, the reviews would be 5 hours long if we had to explain every single aspect of why it's done the way it is.
Yeah.
But we've dedicated hours of content in bite size for, I mean, some of the videos are probably 20 minutes long, but, and I often link to those. It's in the video description of the 9800X3D review. There are 3 videos that come at it from almost 3 different angles that try to explain to you what it is you should be looking out for, historically why this has worked out well, going off this sort of guidance. I don't know what more I can do. But anyway, it's just an ongoing thing. But I think on our channel, I just see those comments and, just move past them. But I just felt really bad for the guys at Hardware Canucks that were just copying, a fair bit of an unjust amount of use, which would be any amount on this sort of subject, because they'd done the right thing by their viewers, and people were, criticizing them, laughing at them, mocking them, abusing them for doing so, which annoyed me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's a difficult one, because I think maybe some people in that example were caught up with, we have criticized 720p testing in the past, but in some circumstances,
not aggressive. Like I don't really care about it. Like it's not like I'm not one way or the other. It's
I think my opinion on it was more that you can show what you are trying to show at 720p at 1080p. Like in most circumstances, that has been possible.
Especially with modern GPUs, I've seen multiple instances where the 4090 is actually slower when you start to lower the resolution below 1080. Like you just can't feed the cores enough information. It becomes sort of like what you see with the higher core count CPUs. It just becomes inefficient at how it's going, which sounds weird, but it's definitely a thing, and it definitely happens. How often, hard to say, but I mean, we found an 11% uplift. Hardware Canucks only found an 11% uplift when they went down to 720p. So it must be that either the sample of games we're using or the way that we're testing them is more CPU demanding than the way they're doing it. And I've really tried to cull games that are very light on the CPU for CPU reviews, because they don't tell us what future CPU demanding games are going to be like. So like the Forza games, don't use them. Black Myth Wukong, useless CPU benchmark. But we also point out to people that not all games are this CPU limited. But anyway, you can't give the disclaimers constantly. It's kind of like we're really making our content for PC enthusiasts. Like it's not, I mean, that much should be obvious, right? I think there's other channels that are probably simplify things further than we do. We like to simplify things quite a bit. We don't go as technical or in-depth as like Gamers Nexus. We try to avoid that. That's sort of a deliberate decision we've made to make it more simple. But some people like the overly technical stuff. Even if it doesn't apply directly to the product, like as in buying advice, they just like to know all of that extra nerdy stuff, which is fine. But it's not typically, not always anyway, is the path we take.
Sometimes when it comes to things like education, it's you just got to push people towards the right direction. And
I'm trying.
I like to think that our video is educational, so we want to provide information that's pushing people towards the right way and is educating people on the right ways to do things. But anyway, we've been talking for so long in this episode about the 98.
I was to say, and to be clear, like it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to not know. It's okay to ask the questions. It's okay to request those tests. And that's why I made 3 videos where I think I calmly and carefully explained the situation. If you come away from that, then you still want to argue. That's where I get a bit frustrated because, anyway, sorry, go on, Tim. Wrap this thing up. Stop me, Tim.
Stop talking about CPUs, Steve. I'm trying to get out of this podcast. No, it's all good. I was just saying that, we probably won't talk about boring lies because we've just spoken for nearly 2 hours on this. So we'll keep all of our interesting extra things for next time, where we'll probably have pretty much nothing to talk about because the CPUs come out and there's pretty much nothing else happening. So we'll save that for another day. But hopefully everyone has gotten some interesting thoughts out of our 9800X3D podcast recap in this episode. Lots of like we've said, it's an interesting part, which means there's now more things to talk about, more follow-up content for the channel. People can get hyped about it, people could talk about it, and that's just good for the industry. Like to see that sort of thing. So keen for all that follow-up content that you're planning on the Hardware Unboxed main channel. But that's it for this one. As always, audio feed, YouTube feed, depending on what version of the podcast you want, both are available. Thanks to everyone that listens all the way through. Hopefully you enjoy this. You're sitting around driving to work or something. But
I was going to say apologies to everyone who listens the whole way through.
Well, that's true.